Welcome to All About Capital Campaigns, a podcast that provides fuel for your nonprofit's growth. Each week, hosts Andrea Kilstedt and Amy Eisenstein, co-founders of the Capital Campaign Toolkit, provide practical tips about raising more money for your nonprofit organization. The Capital Campaign Toolkit is a support system for nonprofit leaders who are running capital campaigns. At capitalcampaigntoolkit.com, you can download a step-by-step guide for your capital campaign and get many other free resources. This podcast is recorded on a live webinar every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join the live session and get your questions answered by signing up today at toolkittalks.com.
Today, we are going to kick off a discussion of feasibility studies because, of course, we often get questions about feasibility studies. And Amy, I have a thought I'd like to kick it off with because I find people often are confused about feasibility studies. With some frequency, we get calls or inquiries from people who think that a feasibility study is that they can just go out and talk to their largest donors and find out how much money they can raise, and then they decide what they're going to spend it on. Right? Don't we hear that?
Yes.
It's like, well, how can we design a project if we don't know how much money we can raise? So first, we're going to do a feasibility study to check and see how much money we can raise. And then if it turns out we can raise $5 million, we'll design a $5 million project. But that's not how it works. Now, I want to be really clear about that. That's not how it works. If that's in your mind, get it out of your mind. Just flush it out of your mind. So here's why it doesn't work that way. What a feasibility study really is that it is an opportunity for you to test with your largest donors a plan that you have to do something that is going to move your organization forward. So if, for example, your organization needs a new building, and there are many other things you can do campaigns around, but let's say your organization needs a new building, you have to begin by saying, all right, what is it we really need? How big should the building be? What is it going to do? What's the program? How much is it likely to cost? What are the other things we might put in so that if we could raise this money, we actually would move our organization ahead effectively? And maybe you put all of those are campaign objectives. What are you going to raise the money for? And you put dollar figures next to them, and then you add up those dollar figures, and it gives you a number. When you go out and you talk to your donors in a feasibility study, you are testing that plan and that goal. And what you're going to learn is whether you can raise that much money or whether you can raise more money if people are super excited, or less money. But it is more or less money for a particular concept, not just in general, how much money would you give me? And you can understand that if I say to Amy, let's pretend that Amy is a big philanthropist, and Amy is a philanthropist, but let's pretend she can add a few zeros onto what she might otherwise give. And I represent a school where her kids go. And I come to her and I say, hey, Amy, we'd like to raise some money, right? There are a whole lot of things that we want to do. And if you tell us how much money we're going to give, you could possibly give us, then we'll decide what we want to do with it. No.
Then I'm going to say, well, maybe $1,000, right? Because I'm not excited about that general request, right? But if they come to me, to finish Andrea's story, and say, we want to do a performing arts center, we want to have a pool for athletics, we want to have a new gym, then I can wrap my brain around it and say, oh, now that's something I want to support because that's important to me, or I understand how that's important to the community, right? I finished your story, Andrea. Keep going.
Thank you. That's exactly right. That was the point, that you have to start by looking at where your organization is. You are driven by an understanding of your organization and what it is you want to do that grows out of strategic planning often, right? Or may grow out of some kind of other planning, but that actually develops a plan that is the plan that is best designed to move your organization to the next level of function. And once you have that, then you can put some numbers around it and you can say, all right, now let us go and talk to our donors, not about money, really. We're going to go talk to our donors about this plan and see if the plan is something they can get behind. And if it is, then we're going to say, well, if we're going to do this plan, it's going to cost us $10 million. Is this something you would support? So the point here really is this, that fundraising is seldom about money. Does that sound strange?
No, no, I say that all the time. And I think we need to remind people, and I always ask, what is fundraising about? It's not about money. It's about impact, right? It's about what you're going to accomplish, what you're going to be doing. And so how the community is going to look and feel different after you've finished your campaign. So I always say fundraising isn't about money. It's about the difference you're going to make. So if you can remember that and remind your donors and your board members, you're going to be in much better shape. Andrea, we dive right in sometimes because we just can't wait to get started. I do want to remind everybody that we always start with a specific topic, but then we're happy to answer any campaign or fundraising related questions that we can get to. They go in the Q&A box, preferably not in the chat. Sometimes the chat goes by so quickly that we can't find all the questions in the chat. But I have to admit, David has fed us sort of a softball feasibility study question about international feasibility studies. It is in the chat box, not in the Q&A box. And I think it's such a great question, especially today, Andrea, because we are doing more and more on Zoom and remotely. And so when you ask about an international feasibility study, I think honestly, this year, if there's any silver lining to COVID, it is that everybody is accustomed to doing things online. So we can certainly talk about that. But we do want to talk. I am curious in the chat if people would say whether they're thinking about a feasibility study, not quite there, started a feasibility study, way past their feasibility study, just to get a sense of where everybody is who's joining us today. We'll spend another 5 minutes or so on it. And then I encourage you to put any questions you brought today into the Q&A box. So Andrea, I know you've been busy looking at the Q&A box here, but let's talk about for briefly the difference between a typical feasibility study and how we like to think about feasibility studies and the pros and cons of those. Right. And then sort of go back to David's question about international feasibility studies.
Yep. So the traditional feasibility study, which has been around for a very long time, is a study where you hire a consultant, and the consultant helps you develop, sort of package your plan and put together a list of people who have the potential to be your largest donors, and a preliminary case for support, and then a consultant goes out and interviews your largest donors and collates what it is they have found out, and then comes back to you and says, in essence, I have talked to 30 of your largest donors, and then I have crunched those numbers, and I believe that you are not able to raise $10 million, but I believe that you can raise between $3 and $5 million. I'm just making those numbers up, of course. But they are the people who go out and talk to your donors, and they gather the information and they add it up, and they do some kind of complicated consultant's math, which if you're interested in it, I probably could say more about, but I won't for the moment, and sort of make a calculation that they are then willing to stand behind. Yep. Right. Sometimes what they actually come back and say, yes, you can raise the amount of money that you think you can raise, but often it turns out you can't raise that much money, and they'll come back with a lower estimate. Now that does a number of things. First of all, it engages donors because someone is going out to talk to donors. Second of all, it gives some credibility to your campaign goal, for your campaign goal to your board. Because board members almost always are afraid are anxious when they're going into capital campaigns. They're not sure you can really raise all that money. They're worried about being on the board of an organization that's going to fail, right? They don't want to put themselves in that position. So for them to have an expert consultant come in and say, yes, you can do this, makes the board feel far more confident in approving a campaign and approving a campaign goal. Now, these studies have gone on forever. I've always wondered, or for many years, I wondered why consultants did those interviews. And several years ago, some donor friends of mine came to me and said, hey, we really don't, our calendars are full of these consultants beating a path to our doors. We would much rather talk to the leadership of the organization. Can't you figure out another way to do that? So that got me thinking, right? That was interesting to hear. And since then, Amy and I have been hard at work saying, all right, can we come up with a different model? And can we come up with a model where the leaders of the organization actually go out and talk to the donors rather than sending a consultant out? Now, what a consultant will tell you about that idea is that donors will tell them things that they won't tell the leadership of an organization. Right? And certainly you can imagine that to be the case, right? If a donor thinks the executive director is lousy, the donor is not going to look the executive director who's there talking to them in the face and say, well, I think you stink, right? That's simply not going to happen. They're going to make nice. They're going to walk around the problem, right? And I actually believe that if you can frame a conversation well, and if you ask a donor to tell you what it is that they think is wonderful and not so wonderful about your organization, they will be relieved to do so. And they may do it in a way that is a little more, what's the word? Reserved or politic. I mean, right? Than if they were talking to someone entirely outside of the organization. But if you can listen, if you can pose the questions and listen, you can, in our experience, learn remarkable things from the donors. And I'll stop. And what happens is when you have these real flowing conversations about real things and what the donor really thinks, you and your leadership strengthen the relationship between the donor and your organization. And that is powerfully important.
Yeah, let me emphasize that. So first of all, you focused on from the perspective of the consultant will say, well, donors won't always open up to us, or won't necessarily open up to somebody from the organization, but will open up to us because we promise anonymity, confidentiality. On the other end, I've heard just as many donors say, this is a stranger coming into my community. I don't really want to talk to a stranger. I'd much rather talk to the executive director or the board chair because I feel like my feedback's really going to be heard and they can do something about it. I think that is a major challenge with consultant-led feasibility studies, is that they offer a report and recommendations at the end of their study, but they don't say who said what because everything is anonymous and confidential. And so frequently what I hear from executive directors is that the recommendations aren't that helpful because they're so general and collated and sort of smushed together. And so we have a different way of doing a feasibility study where we say, okay, the key staff and leaders of the organization can be trained and coached to go out and have these very important conversations with donors themselves, and with our assistants, make appropriate recommendations and guidance to the board about how to proceed with the campaign. So the one thing that you didn't mention, Andrea, is, this is a critical, so forget the money, forget figuring out how much you can raise in a campaign. I think that a a good feasibility study is a unique opportunity to build relationships with your key donors, talk to them about the project long before you ask them for a gift. And so I've actually seen in the chat here a couple of things. One is, somebody said they skipped a feasibility study, and I know that lots of organizations skip a feasibility study. But if your organization is not quite there yet, I would encourage you not to skip it. You may decide that you don't need to do it with a consultant. You may need, there's several people asking about do-it-yourself feasibility studies in the chat box. And so we believe that you should do some sort of leadership donor interviews or conversations prior to campaign, whether you do them formal, traditional way with a consultant that goes in and does the interviews, whether you do them with us, where we guide you through the process and your leaders go out and do the interviews, or you truly do it yourself. We think you should absolutely talk to your donors about the project before you officially launch any sort of campaign. All right, so let's move on to some questions in the Q&A box. There's lots of them now. So Andrea, is there any one that's catching your eye?
Well, let's just start at the top. Jacqueline's asked this question. Is it beneficial to have a visioning session with the board regarding the scope of the project before doing leadership interviews for the feasibility study? So, and I would say, Jacqueline, you can call it whatever you wish. It is important for your board to be on board about whatever it is you're talking to people about, right? You don't want to be talking to your donors about something that your board isn't behind. So whatever the process is going to be, whether it's a visioning session or, a longer term planning process or one meeting. I mean, if the board has to be on board, because you sure don't want the donors to run into a board member at Costco and say, hey, Joe, somebody just came and talked to me about your project, and Joe, the board member, says, what project? You don't want that to happen. So yes, by all means, Jacqueline, you need to do something to make sure your board knows what you're talking to people about.
Excellent. So now Meg's asking, is there a standard pledge payment rate for campaigns? I would think it would be higher for a campaign versus an annual fund pledge. So Meg, I mean, you're on the right track, but I think you're thinking about it the wrong way. So no, there's no standard pledge payment rate for campaigns. But yes, a campaign is designed to inspire and motivate people to think about giving significantly larger gifts than they would for their annual fund payment. So the big difference, one of the many big differences between campaign fundraising and annual fundraising is annual fundraising is really a gift that donors make year after year, hopefully, out of their cash flow, out of their checking account, that they make to support the ongoing operations and needs of an organization. A campaign is a special, unique, one-time, once in a while kind of gift that donors dig deep for and actually often give significantly more than their annual fund gift. And often those gifts are made from assets. And that's how donors are able to make significantly larger gifts. So Andrea wrote a brilliant blog post that will be on our blog tomorrow about how donors think about making these campaign gifts and giving decisions. And the example she gives is somebody making a gift, a significant gift with tax benefits out of a retirement fund. But, people can use stock and real estate and all sorts of life insurance, all sorts of different gifts.
So Amy, I wonder if the gist of Meg's comment, and Meg, you may want to clarify this, is how many people actually pay on their pledges? As opposed to people not paying. Is that the gist of your question, Meg?
Oh, did I get it all wrong?
I'm not sure. But that's what I read when I read a standard pledge payment rate.
Yes, she said yes.
Yes,
so go ahead.
What percentage of people actually don't pay? Let me do it the other way. What's the percentage of people who who bug out, right? And I don't have any official percentages for you, Meg, but what I can say is that it's not uncommon to count on 4 or 5% of pledges not coming through in the end. And that I look at it two ways. By and large, the larger gifts and pledge payments will happen. But the smaller gifts, when someone pledges, $250 a month a year for each of 3 years, or $100 a year for 5 years, or something like that, those fall away more. So if you look at the numbers of pledges that don't get paid off, the numbers look higher, but the dollars are relatively low. In terms of people who don't pay their pledges. I don't know what that looks like in terms of annual funding. Do you have a sense of that, Amy?
No, but what I would say about that is, probably there's less pledging for annual fund than there is for a multi-year campaign. Tim's chiming in here, standard 95% payment rate. He's saying,
yeah, I guess that means that I'm right in the 5% non-payment rate. It's just matter how you look at it.
Yes. But I think, one of the things we do know is that the longer the pledge period, the more chance of people dropping off. So we encourage you to use a 3-year pledge period, not go to 5 or, longer sometimes. But sometimes organizations that are trying campaigns for the first time and they don't know what they're doing, they decide on a 5-year payment plan. You can make exceptions to any rule, but generally you want people paying in 3 years.
Amy, you bought a car recently, Amy?
Right.
Yes. In the last 2 years. Yes.
One of my early mentors and advisors used to say that the typical pledge period for a capital campaign is the same as the number of years that people buy cars over.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know how many years people are buying cars over these days. I don't know if you pay or pay off over 3 years or 5 years, but he said that he thought there was an equivalence between those two.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder if I wonder if there's any data to back that up. My guess is that, that's funny. Kathleen's saying that dealers are offering 6-year loans. You know what, Andrea, I'm not buying that. I think it's a funny example, but I think major donors pay off their cars when they buy them. They're not paying them off over time. I don't know. Unless there's 0% interest.
No. I think his point was not that the major donors did that, but just that it became sort of a culturally acceptable pledge period, right? His point was not that your major donors figured it out that way. But anyway,
I see. All right.
I just remembered it from my past.
That's funny. Okay. All right. So let's see. Katie, what are best practices? Katie's asking, what are best practices for public fundraising? And she's asking text to donate. So listen, I'm going to go to the chat box on this one and let people talk about how they do their crowdfunding. But this is for the very, very end of your campaign, the end of the public phase of your campaign, where you're going to the community, to your base for support. And it's for the last 5, 10, maybe 15% of your campaign. So Katie, I don't want you to think that this is the way to start a capital campaign. You start with your biggest donors with very personal solicitations. It's not about text to donate or public fundraising at the beginning. But maybe there are some great, and she says, correct, we're in the home stretch. So that's great.
Great.
So in the chat, maybe other people can talk about ways that they are thinking about their crowdfunding.
Yep.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. Anne wants to know if the tactics are the same between individuals, foundations, and corporations. So I can start that off, Amy, to say, if you really, really step way back from that, for every gift, someone is making a decision. Right? Someone is making a decision. So in the end, you want to find out who is making the decision and what you can do to influence that decision. So in that sense, they are the same, right? This isn't the foundation making a decision or a corporation making a decision. It is some person. And if you're clever and can figure that out, it will benefit you. Now, there are, of course, significant differences. Right. Foundations. Now we're talking about family foundations are one thing, right? Family foundations often act just like individuals do, though there may be a few more family members involved, maybe or maybe not. For larger foundations, of course, they function. They have a different side to their function that has a set of deadlines and certain requirements and certain things they want to give to. They have a more formal structure that you have to, of course, pay attention to. In some sense, you also have to pay attention to the way an individual donor gives. But individual donors don't often write a description of it. With foundations, if you're lucky, you can go and find a description of it. So it's more transparent in some way than with individual donors. Corporations, with some degree of frequency, corporations are doing this for marketing purposes. Again, there is someone making a decision. If you can find out who they are, it will only benefit you. And if you can find out why they give and where that money comes from within the corporation, then you can adapt your approach to fit that, right? For some, it's all marketing. For some, it actually is a philanthropic budget, but you need to find that out. So they're probably more the same than not the same in concept, but there certainly are differences.
Excellent. So I just want to point to the chat box. Amy Shower has said, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Oh my goodness, now it just disappeared. Somewhere along the way before my time, someone at her organization, let a donor pledge out for 10 years. She says, do not do that. They were still paying off the pledge when the next campaign came around.
Bad idea. I worked for an organization in California for a while that had a donor who wanted to give $1 million. Now, the problem was and he was going to give it $100,000 a year for 10 years. Right? The problem was that the organization needed the money then to build its facility. So it had to borrow against that. It cost them more to borrow that money and to collect the pledge than it would have been not to get the pledge at all. So, and they just couldn't, they approved it, and it was a big mistake. Amy, I wonder if that's the same organization that the organization you work for.
Yeah. No, probably not.
No, probably not.
All right. So someone anonymous is asking, how long is the data from a feasibility study valid? How do you redo after 18 months? And I think that question is especially valid now that we're, through COVID. Maybe it's valid for a year and a half in normal times, but if you did a feasibility study 18 months ago, I would say that it is a long time to go reconnect with your donors and revisit the topic. What would you say, Andrea?
Yeah, you're not going to want to call it a redo. Right, that's what I would say, but you're going to want to go and talk to your donors. You're going to call it a check-in or a set of leadership interviews. Just taking a sort of assessing what they think now. Of course, the subtext of that is that the more you talk to your donors about real things, the better. And one of the things about COVID, where people have become more comfortable talking through Zoom, is that these are fairly easy to do these days, right? They're somehow much easier and less time consuming than when you had to go schlepping across the state, had to set up an appointment and go schlepping across the state and sit down with somebody and chit chat. And these are, you can actually do this pretty easily. You should be talking to your donors a lot now. Right. And Zoom makes that wonderfully, wonderfully possible.
All right. So Sharon in the chat box, I want to just read this. She says, our prior capital campaign began without a strong major gift phase. We engaged over 700 donors, but the average pledge was 4,000 over 5 years, and we did not reach our goal. Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. I appreciate it. There is this myth out there with your board members, and the myth is that everybody gives the same amount or should or can or whatever they think. And that if you need to raise, I'm going to use a small number just for this example, that if you need to raise $100,000, all you need to do is go out and find 100 people to give you $1,000 each, right? Now, of course, that math works. 100 people giving you $100,000 each does get you to $100,000, but it's really hard to find 100 people who want to give you $1,000 each. And multiply that number into the millions, which are typical capital campaigns, and it really doesn't work. And so you're thinking about, you have to with the capital campaign, start with those leadership level gifts that are, 10 and 20% of your campaign goal. So, all right. So it's interesting. Terry, I think from the last question, is commenting that they don't think that a study held just prior to COVID needs to be duplicated. And I have to say, I don't agree with that. We're a year out. I think people's priorities have changed. You need to at least check in. I don't know about duplicated.
Nobody should duplicate a study. You don't want to go back to a donor and say, hey, Mr. Donor, we're coming to duplicate what we did before. No, you want to say, we want to get a sense of what you think now, given all that's happened, right? How does this affect you and your giving? How do you think this should shift or change what we're thinking about doing, right? What's wrong with doing that, right? Nothing. It's fantastic to do that. And by the way, do you have time now to serve on our steering committee, which you didn't have before COVID? Maybe you're willing to do that now that we have virtual meetings. I mean, you can have all kinds of great conversations, but you never say, well, we did this and now it's outdated and now we're going to do it again. You say, we did this and we learned a lot from it, right? And thank you so much for participating. And we've picked a few people from that list just to touch base with again. Wouldn't that make you feel good as a donor? Of course it would, right? You have to be smart about this
and
stuff.
Just remember, lots of times a feasibility study comes back, a report and recommendations with things that you need to work on before you can raise the money. So frequently, when a consultant provides a report back that says you can't do a campaign, or, people ask, what if we get a report that says we can't do a campaign? Very infrequently does that happen. They may say, here are the 5 or 10 things that you need to work on. So you can say, for the last year, we've been working on building relationships with donors and shoring up our fundraising infrastructure and developing all sorts of things, and say, now we think we're really ready for a campaign. So these, we followed the recommendations of that we learned the last time we came and talked to you, and now we're ready to go, and we want to talk to you and get your feedback again.
So that's actually interesting, Amy. It's one of the advantages of a study where the leadership goes and does its own interviews. Mm-hmm. Because if a consultant has done those interviews, you have nothing to go on, right? But if you've done those interviews, and I know that major donor Amy had a concern about such and such, I can go back to her and say, Amy, I remember that you were concerned about such and such, and here's the way we're addressing it. Do you think that's going to work? Right. Yeah. And if I hadn't done that interview, I wouldn't have known what Amy's concern was.
Yes.
Right. So it gives me an opportunity to follow up in a way that's real and that makes good sense.
Yeah. So listen, if you guys are if you're thinking about a feasibility study, if you're not quite there yet, or you're just about to launch, I would encourage you, I ask you to go to the Capital Campaign Toolkit website, and under services, you'll see our section on feasibility study. We make a very compelling case for the leaders of your organization to do these interviews with guidance from us. We're not, suggesting that you go out and do it alone, unaided, but if you want really, really detailed outline of what a guided feasibility study looks like, you can find it on our website under services.
So let's go to Susie's question. It's about gift range charts. And they're about one of my favorite topics, gift range charts are. So Susie wants to know, in a gift range chart, how do you determine the number of gifts needed per level? She understands that between 65 and 70% of the goal comes from a small group of large donors, the top part of the pyramid. And a related question is there a common ratio for the prospects needed per level? Well, I can do a reasonable job of addressing some of that for you. So, first of all, Susie, this is not the answer you want, but the real answer is it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on the size and shape of your donor base. Right? If yours is an organization with a very narrow donor base, let's say you only have 300 donors who have ever given to you, ever, that means that your gift range chart needs to be very steep because you don't have the base to go to, of people to go to for the bottom end of your campaign, right? Your campaign needs to be like, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower, right? As opposed to the pyramids. How's that for images, right? So if your organization is well established and has been around a long time and you have several thousand donors, then you can have a broader gift range chart. But in any case, a place to begin your thinking, and then you will adapt to fit your organization, is to say the top gift on a gift range chart you should probably start your thinking at between 20 or 25% of your campaign goal. Right. So if you're doing a campaign for, I don't know, $10 million, start thinking about the lead gift as being, $2.5 million. And then you're going to go down and create your gift range chart. And I always sort of feel my way into these things, right? By the time I get down to the bottom, I have a sense, well, do we have donors at this level or at that level? Or, are we going to run aground because we don't have 10 people who are going to give us $50,000? And then you go back up to the top and you adjust the top gift. So I like the idea of developing your gift range chart, not by a formulaic Excel spreadsheet where you plug in a number and it gives you a gift range chart, but actually where you're playing with the gift range chart to try to make it fit your organization. Now, to get to the second part of your question, is there a common ratio between prospects needed at each level? So I have long believed that the ratio changes through the gift range chart. And at the biggest gifts, if you have been doing fundraising effectively, you will have a pretty good idea who those biggest donors are. You will have spent a lot of your time and energy working with those people, cultivating those people. So I would assume that you're going to need perhaps 2 prospects per gift at the top levels of your gift chart. But once you get down to the middle, you won't have had the time to cultivate those donors as well. They won't be as close to your institution, right? You won't know as much about them. So maybe in the middle, you're going to need 3 or 4 prospects per gift. And by the time you get to the bottom, where really you're just dealing with people through direct mail or through, crowdsourced fundraising, you really don't know very much about those at all. And maybe it's 10 prospects per gift down at the bottom. So you can play with that formula, if you will. Now, how do these 2 questions come together? If you put your gift range chart together and you do those multipliers, maybe, 2 prospects for 1 gift for the top 3 levels and then broader, and you add up all the number of prospects you need for that gift range chart, and the number of prospects you need is 4 times the number of prospects you have on your list, your chart's not right. You have to go back and make your chart narrower, because you can't have a chart that says you need 4,000 prospects and your list only has 500 prospects. That's a mismatch. So these things come together if you play with them. Does that make sense, Amy?
Yes. And Jacqueline's saying, she's listening to your top gifts, 2 prospects per gift. And she says that assumes a 50% close rate. I always like to have 3 per ask, assuming a 30% close rate. But, Jacqueline, that's true if you don't have solid relationships with these donors at the very top of your gift chart. And Andrea made that very clear, that if you have worked with these donors before, if you have strong relationships with them, then you can have less prospects at the very top of your gift range chart.
I'll give you a good example of that, Amy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have this wonderful little client I'm working with. It's going to be really just the cap off of my career. It just is so fun to work with him. So, Jacqueline, they had one prospect for the top gift. One. That was
Right.
it. It's a $10 million campaign. They had one prospect for $3 million. They didn't have anybody else at that level. That's what it was. They went and asked that donor. They said to me, what should we ask them for? $3 million. Yes, you should ask them for $3 million. They went and asked them for $3 million. And guess what? They got it. There were no other people at that level. Now, they had a long relationship with this organization, with this foundation, right? This was not out of the blue. They had a good relationship, not only with the people who run the foundation now, but with the prior generation who set up the foundation. So there was reason to think that risk was worthwhile, right? Even though you're right, Jacqueline, that's a pretty awe-inspiring close rate, 100%, right? Okay.
Yeah. So I like this question from Anonymous about, is it appropriate to go back to donors from the feasibility study who did not give at the beginning of the campaign, but now that we're in the final stretch of the last 13% to reach the goal, do you mention they initially said they would give, but did or didn't? So listen, I think absolutely you should go back to those donors. Every donor has a different way of giving and a different way of thinking about their giving in the campaign. Some donors like to kick off that campaign and be those leadership level gifts and get the campaign off to a strong start. Other donors want to make sure that you're really going to be successful before they put their money in. They're a little more cautious or hesitant. I don't know what the word is. So those people, if you felt it was appropriate to see them in your feasibility study stage and they haven't given yet, absolutely go back to them and say, will you help us cross the finish line? We've only got, 10 or 15% way to go towards the goal. And your gift now will really help get us there. I mean, I don't think you need to mention that they said they would or wouldn't give. I mean, that's not relevant anymore, honestly. But just say, we talked about this program, 18 months ago, 24 months ago, and here we are, we've raised 85% of the money, and we are going to ask you for your support now. We need it more than ever so that we can cross that finish line.
Yes.
All right.
So I want to answer Gary Bukowski's question. And Gary, it always tickles me to see a question from you. I tell you, Gary has decades of experience in this field, and he knows full well how he would do that. But let me add my 2 cents. And then, Gary, if you have other thoughts, please do put them in the chat box for people so they can learn from your wisdom. So how have you used Capital Campaign Committee cabinet to reach out to potential prospects? So there are several things come to my mind. This is not a well-organized answer, perhaps, but one of the things that comes to my mind is yes, you do want to use your cabinet members to reach out to prospects. And of course, the first step of that is finding out who they know and who they think they can reach out to. And one of the things that I've learned about that is that people function better if you start them off by showing them a list rather than sitting down with a blank piece of paper and saying, who do you know? Right? So always start with a list of people and say, here are a list of people we've put together. Do you know anyone on this list? And do you know anyone well enough so that you could help us reach out to them? Right? And people somehow feel more comfortable. They're more inspired to do that if you start with a list. Some people who serve on cabinets are more or less comfortable reaching out to people they know. And they're more or less comfortable doing it in different ways. Some people are willing to set up a meeting, right, to take you out to lunch with someone, but they're not willing to ask people for a gift. It's okay. You have to go with people where they are and where they're comfortable. I've learned over the years that it doesn't pay to try to force people to do something they're incredibly uncomfortable doing. But does that mean they can't help? No. Maybe they can write an email and do an e-introduction right these days. If the times are opening up and we actually see one another, they can schedule a lunch. But it begins by finding out who knows whom and what about those people might indicate that they would be interested in your project, right? I wouldn't forget that. I don't want anyone to go and talk to someone to ask them for money unless you have a reasonable reason, unless there is some reason to believe that they might be interested in your project. So that's the first thing you're trying to find out. Now, Gary, that was a pretty simplistic answer. I think you probably have much better ways of doing that. If so, please post them.
All right, we have some great questions from anonymous folks. How long should your campaign committee be involved and, more importantly, be active the entire time of the campaign? And how do you move committee members who are not helping off that committee? We have some great answers. Go ahead, Andrea. Talk about Capital Campaign Committee structure.
Oh, Amy, you start this one.
All right. Okay. So we've had some wonderful blog posts. So feel free to go to the Capital Campaign Toolkit blog and search for campaign committees. But our philosophy is that you have multiple campaign committees. I think of them as subcommittees or ad hoc committees that go and ebb and flow with your campaign. Only a very few people on a very small committee need to be involved for the full 3 or 4 years prior to actually starting your campaign. What do we call that? The core? Is that the core committee, Andrea?
Yeah, that's right.
The core committee.
Sort of the kitchen. I used to call it the kitchen cabinet.
Yeah, the kitchen cabinet, the core committee. They're the only ones, 3, 4, maybe 5 people, including your executive director, board chair, campaign committee chair, and development director. A few people are on that committee from start to finish. But more likely, you're going to invite. It's a wonderful opportunity to engage lots of donors throughout your campaign. So you might invite somebody to be part of your feasibility study planning campaign and just invite them for 3 meetings over 6 weeks. And they will help you figure out how you're going to do your feasibility study and be involved through presenting to the board. I know that doesn't happen in 6 weeks, but, a short period of time, right? You might have a campaign planning committee that reviews and evaluates and makes tweaks and recommendations to your campaign plan. Maybe they only commit to 2 meetings. And you have a variety of committees as the campaign moves forward, a committee to plan your public kickoff, a campaign committee to do some of the mid-level asking. And so the ones that are wonderful, your campaign committee members, once they served on one committee, you might invite them to serve on the others. If they're not doing such a good job, you thank them for their service and that committee comes to an end. And of course, you list all of them when you thank your full overarching umbrella campaign committee. But we like to think about campaign committees as these, ad hoc, moving through, I don't know.
Yeah, short-term assignments. It's hard. It feels lousy, in my experience anyway, if you have a committee, let's say you have a committee of 15 people and gradually every time you meet, there are fewer people. That just doesn't feel good, right? So rather than that, if you can structure it to say, we're going to meet and have 3 meetings. And then you have a chance to celebrate what people accomplished. And then you can pull some of those people back together for another committee. So you think about it in terms of flights. Is that the right word? That's a good word.
Yeah. I think that is
or there's a better word than that. But think about that as a model if you can get it to work.
All right. Good. Let's go on to the next question. Again, from somebody anonymous. After the feasibility study, we now know that the project will cost $1 million more than presented in the feasibility study. So what do we do about our goal? Do we use the one in the feasibility study, or how do we address the more realistic dollar cost?
I know
Go
what
ahead.
I do.
Yes, go ahead, Andrea.
I do. I would, first of all, I always like you to use the word working goal. Right? The word working goal, it's like a draft goal. I'm sure we've said this before, but it's worth restating. So if you know the project is going to cost $1 million more, I wouldn't have any hesitation to say, feasibility study said we could raise $5 million, but the working goal for this campaign is going to be $6 million because we know that's what we need to raise. If we find we can't and we have to borrow some money, then we can always pull it down. But I think if you know that right up front, I think there's no problem with having a working goal that's higher than your feasibility study. Not by tens of millions of dollars, but by $1 million. It's just, these days, millions. Well, what's $1 million here or there?
There, right? Everybody knows that the cost of your campaign is going to rise as,
Exactly.
construction costs go up, this, that, and the thing. But listen, go ahead, Andrea.
Well, I was just going to go to David Madigan's question is just sitting here staring me in the face, and I don't know what to say about it. I just have to read it so people who hear it on the what do you call it, the podcast. So he says, we conducted crowd funds 7 years ago that raised $1.4 million in 45 days from 33,000 donors in 108 countries and 6 continents. We need to further understand our market. I think that's right. I have no idea how to advise you to do that.
All right. This is what I want to say to David, and other people might add something in the chat. My guess is that this was either something that went viral, that you got super lucky, that you created something that went viral, and or something to do with natural disaster relief. Right. So there was a hurricane or a typhoon or a tsunami or something happened that the funding poured in from. These are not your loyal long-term donors. And I think you do need to further understand your market. So I would go look at those 33,000 donors and see who made a second gift. Right. So this was, 7 years ago. Oh, my God. So see who's still donating from that time. And those are the people that you can go talk to. My guess is that number is very small. They were giving one time just because of something that happened. So, all right, Derry, I think last but not least, and then we'll wrap up. When considering the number of donors in your donor base, what is a reasonable giving criteria to use in terms of recency and number of gifts? Good question. Do you have a baseline that you use for that, Andrea?
Yeah, the more, it's really simple, Derry. The more gifts, the more recent, the higher, the more you can ask them for, right?
And the more likely that they'll give.
And the more likely that they'll give. Exactly. So by all, looking at both of those things together, recency and frequency of giving is a wonderful way to look at your donor base, to prioritize it. Now, of course, those people won't always match up with the people who could give you the largest gifts. So then you have to, put that together. I mean, if someone is giving you $10 a month or $10 a week for 33 years, they may be a better plan giving prospect than a prospect for a major gift. That doesn't mean you should ignore them, but you have to look at what those patterns are. And there are some organizations who have done a remarkable job of sending monthly solicitations and stories. I mean, I think Covenant House has done a wonderful job over many, many years of reaching out to their donors. Every month they send a heart-rending story to their donors, and they have people who send them $20 every time they get a letter, or for years. The reality is, if you try to convert those people who give that way through that mechanism, it's very difficult to convert them. Right? People who respond to monthly giving, very hard to convert them. So you have to look at not only the recency and the frequency, but what the relationship is of the donor to the organization. So that's the caveat about all of that, Derry.
Excellent. I think this was an amazing, robust conversation. I love getting all the different diverse questions. I want to remind everybody, whether you're with us live on Monday afternoons or you are listening to our podcast, just a reminder, we do tape these live every Monday. And if you want to join us live, it's at capitalcampaigntoolkit.com/toolkit talks. If you want to listen via podcast, you can do that. The podcast is called All About Capital Campaigns. And we would be so grateful if you would subscribe and give us a 5-star review. Andrea, you have some final words?
I do, which is that next week we are going to talk about building your board to get ready for a capital campaign. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to be on live so you can ask your question, pop on with us next Monday.
Bring your board members.
Bring your board members. Exactly. That would be great. So,
all right. We'll see you next week, everybody.
Fun to see you. Hi, Pam.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for joining Amy and Andrea for today's All About Capital Campaigns. To learn more about them and their work together, go to capitalcampaigntoolkit.com.